Former Secretary of State Colin Powell is on the line. He served as Ronald Reagan's national security advisor from 1987 to 1989. Of course, a longtime administration person for years and so respected. General Powell, thanks for calling.
Thank you, Katie. How are you today?
I'm good. You know, we just thought it would be meaningful to hear some of your thoughts on Nancy Reagan, because I know you got to know her well. Some people said that if you worked for President Reagan, you also worked for Mrs. Reagan. What was your experience like?
Well, I entered the White House in January of 1987, and the reason I came in with Frank Carlucci, he was the national security advisor. I was his initial deputy, then I took over from him. But the reason we came in is the presidency was in crisis. It was the aftermath of Iran-Contra. The NSC had been fired, changes had been made, and we came in at what was a low point in the administration, and our job was to fix that and turn it around, and I think we succeeded in doing that. Howard Baker, Ken Duberstein, Frank Carlucci, myself, I think you're familiar with that period. But we worked for Ronald Reagan. Now, she, of course, was Mrs. Reagan, and she had influence, there's no question about it. But we never thought she was giving us orders as she was in charge of the White House. And I found that she was an extremely helpful person to have in the White House. President didn't like conflicts, personal conflicts with other people, and sometimes it was Mrs. Reagan who suggested to us that changes had to be made, or she initiated the changes herself. And my own reaction to all of this was that it was reasonable, and she was an essential part of the president's persona. I mean, they were spiritually totally connected, spiritually and in person. And she watched out for him. She watched out for him after he'd been shot. She watched out for him after he had cancer. She watched out for him when we went through the Iran-Contra crisis, and he was at the bottom of his popularity at that point. And, of course, when they left the White House, she looked out for him when he became ill, as you just discussed. And so I think she played a proper role as a first lady, and the criticism she took was, for the most part, unwarranted in my judgment and chump change compared to the kind of criticism you have to take now in public life. And the interesting thing from my perspective is that after they left the White House and went back to California, my relationship with him and with her became even closer now that she wasn't sort of in the center of the storm. And I considered her a dear friend for the rest of her life, and we talked frequently, and she was very warm to me and to my wife, Alma. And so I think she played an important role. And as you just heard your previous speaker note, that she called when she was out of town every night at 10 o'clock. Our experience in the White House was that whenever she went to New York, by the end of the second day, he was becoming nervous and fretful. And by the third day, we were talking to each other, okay, who's going to call and have Nancy come home right now? Because he was not complete without her next to him. And I think that was a wonderful relationship, and I think it's a model, frankly.
You know, I want to talk about their relationship, but I also wanted to mention General Powell about her role in warming relations between the Soviet Union and the United States, and those summits with Gorbachev. I mean, she really, did she, you were, would know much better than I, but didn't she gently nudge him in that direction? And because I know she's widely credited with helping to set the stage for that.
She very much played a role, and of course, she went on these summits, or she was hosting them. And she was also dealing not only with a very charismatic leader of the Soviet Union, but somebody who had a first lady, Raisa, who could match Mrs. Reagan with respect to charisma and glamour. And we relied on Mrs. Reagan to give us our guidance as to how she wanted to play that role. She played it very well. And she also played an important policy role in encouraging President Reagan in his natural inclination to reach out to the Soviets and not look for war, but find ways to cooperate. She shared his view that nuclear weapons were bad. She shared his view that while we understood the Soviet Union, that it was an evil empire, as he called it, and we all had nuclear weapons pointing at one another, she also felt as he did, and she probably felt stronger, that we should reach out and find ways to cooperate. So she played an important role there. And there was a little competition between her and Raisa.
I know that that doesn't
that,
sound like they hit it off very well, General Powell.
Yeah, there was tension there. There's no question about it. And we realized that she felt they upstaged the administration when Mr. Gorbachev came and went strolling up 16th Street with Raisa. And so that was a little bit unexpected of a Soviet leader. Remember who the Soviet leaders were before then. These are not people who would do things like that. Reagan kept trying to get Gorbachev to come on out to California and see the wonders of America. But Gorbachev wasn't buying that. He wanted to stay in Washington, the center of the free world. And they were a heck of a couple. But, you know, the Reagans were a heck of a couple. And at one time, we were going to Moscow for a return meeting. And Mrs. Reagan wanted to do something that might have paralleled what Mrs. Gorbachev had done. And she wanted to visit some refuseniks at their apartment, unannounced. Well, you don't do things in the Soviet Union unannounced, like strolling down 16th Street as Gorbachev did. So we had a major problem because the Soviets were about to say, if this happens, it would be a big blow to a successful summit, and it would guarantee that these people would never be released if you did this and went to see them in their apartment without any warning. And you couldn't get there anyway. We'd make sure you never got there. And so it fell to the National Security Advisor, me, to share this news with Mrs. Reagan. But I did it, and she was not happy, but she accepted it. She understood why it had to be that way. And the one card I had to play was that the Soviets had advised me that if you just don't do this, in a few months those folks will be released. And a few months later, they were released, and I was sitting in the Oval Office when they came to see President and Mrs. Reagan. So she got her desire to get these people freed, which is tricky. But she understood. She understood the role she played, and I liked having her around because without her, I didn't have a complete president to work with. He so relied on her. They were such a unique couple.
I mean, their love story. I was saying it is really one for the ages, isn't it, General Powell? I mean, everyone wishes they had a husband. Well, maybe you do this, General Powell, for Alma, who writes love letters like President Reagan wrote through their entire relationship of, 52 years? Well, not towards the very end, but the love letters he wrote to Nacy Reagan, I mean, they just make your heart melt.
No, they do. I wrote quite a few letters to Alma when I was in Vietnam as a young captain, but we don't write letters because we see each other a lot now, and we've been married 53 years.
Well, what do you think will be Nacy Reagan's legacy? It sounds to me, General Powell, like she was very influential at a time when people, maybe the general public, didn't feel that comfortable with women in general being influential, but that we're all much better for it.
She was influential, but she didn't run the White House. She was influential. We had to pay attention to what she said. And we knew that she was an essential part of that family group, an essential part of Ronald Reagan. And I don't think at the time, other than political opponents and my beloved media, I think most of the American people accepted that and respected it for her. You know, she bought China. Well, it was purchased by private donations, and it wasn't anything that was all that terribly important. It made media news. Her dresses occasionally made media news. But I think that all passed, and I think that's 25, 30 years in the past now. I think people, now that she has gone and now the two of them are together at a better place, I think the American people will recognize the contribution that they made as a family, as a team, his contribution and hers, to a better relationship with the old Soviet Union, with restoring pride in the military, with doing things that enriched the country and brought a spirit back to the country, you know, that shining city on the hill kind of approach. I'll never forget when I was in the Pentagon when he took over as president, and we were all still wearing civilian clothes as generals. And he said, put them all back in uniform. Why aren't they wearing uniforms in Washington? And we did, and it restored pride. In my favorite story, if I've got a moment left, is I went to see President and Mrs. Reagan after they had left the White House at their home in Beverly Hills. And I was a four-star general about to take a new command, and a young sergeant in the recruiting command in Los Angeles drove me up to the house when he finally found it in Bel Air. And I got out of the car about 50 feet away from the house and walked toward the house. But as I was walking toward the house, the soldier said to me, "General, please tell the president how much we respect him for what he did to restore us and to give us pride again." I said, "I sure will."
Aww.
And then I walked up to the house, knocked on the door. President Reagan opened the door. I told him what the soldier had said. Then I said, "You know, sir, he'd love to say hello and meet you. And by all means, by all means." Nacy was standing right behind the president. And the young soldier, frozen in time for a moment, came over and came up to the president and saluted him. And the president saluted him back, and Nacy was smiling. And then the soldier and the president exchanged a few words, and the soldier went back to the car. And as we were going into the house, the president turned to me and said, "Colin, was it okay for me to still salute him?"
Aww.
I said, "Mr. President, don't you ever stop." And then he and Nacy and I went into the living room. And she was as gracious as she could be. She was not on guard anymore, as she had to be in the White House as she looked over things. And we just had a lovely time. And that was a relationship that we had with her until she passed away this morning.